There is a photograph. It was taken in 1904 in the heart of Central Africa, in a place that, at the time, did not appear on any map that told the truth. In it, a man sits on the ground. His name is Nsala. He is a father. He is staring at something. In front of him, two small objects placed carefully on the wooden floorboards before him, as if someone had arranged them, as if someone wanted him to look. They are the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, Boali. She had been killed and partially eaten by agents of a king who lived in a palace in Brussels, Belgium. A king who had never once set foot in Africa. A king who, at that very same moment, was being celebrated across Europe as one of the great humanitarian leaders of the modern age. A man who had convinced the most powerful governments on earth that he was bringing civilization, medicine, and Christianity to the savages of the Congo. The world believed him. For 23 years, the world believed him. His name was King Leopold II of Belgium, and this is not a story about a war. It is not a story about soldiers following orders in the fog of battle. This is the story of one man, one supremely ordinary man with an extraordinary appetite for wealth, who privately owned an entire country the size of Western Europe and used it as a personal laboratory for industrial-scale terror. He never fired a single shot himself. He signed documents from his study in Brussels. He attended charity galas in Paris. He commissioned hospitals and built beautiful parks, and 10 million people, the most conservative estimate historians can agree, on and vanished from the face of the earth under his signature. This is the story of the greatest crime the Western world has chosen to forget. He built an empire on lies, enslaved millions, and died a hero. The untold darkness of King Leopold II. April 9, 1835, Brussels, Belgium. A prince is born. He is given the name Leopold Louis-Philippe Marie Victor, a name with the weight of dynasties already pressed into it. His father is King Leopold II, a cautious, respected ruler of a small nation that has only recently invented itself. Belgium, born from revolution in 1830, is barely 5 years old when this child enters the world. It is a country still figuring out what it wants to be. The child, however, already knows what he wants to be. From his earliest years, Leopold is consumed by a single obsessive idea. Belgium is too small, too insignificant, too easily ignored. While the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, the Netherlands, grow fat and extraordinary on the wealth of colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, Belgium stands at the banquet table with an empty plate. Leopold cannot stand it. As early as 1860, when he is only 25 years old and still holds the title Duke of Brabant, he walks into the office of Belgium's finance minister and places a paperweight on the man's desk. The inscription on it reads in French, "Il faut à la Belgique une colonie." Belgium needs a colony. The finance minister looks at the young duke with the polite contempt reserved for impractical dreamers and tells him that colonies are expensive, risky, and not in Belgium's national interest. Leopold smiles. He leaves the office, and he begins to plan. He studies maps obsessively. He writes private letters, cataloging the colonial profits of other nations the way a hungry man reads a restaurant menu. He travels. He visits India, Egypt, China. He watches how the Dutch squeeze profit from their East Indies colony and writes in his private journal that Belgium must do the same, that colonialism is a taste his country has yet to develop. He tries to acquire a colony in Argentina. He is refused. He investigates the Philippines. He is shut out. He looks at Abyssinia. He looks at Fiji. Every door closes in his face. But then, in 1876, a British-American explorer named Henry Morton Stanley vanishes into the unmapped heart of Central Africa, and re-emerges 2 years later with an extraordinary report. The Congo River Basin, he says, is the largest, most fertile, most resource-rich territory on the African continent. It contains enough rubber, ivory, timber, and mineral wealth to make any nation unimaginably powerful, and crucially, no European power has yet claimed it. Leopold reads Stanley's report, and something ignites in him. He does not tell his government. He does not ask Belgium's parliament. He does not hold a press conference. Instead, Leopold does what he has always done. He maneuvers in private, moves like a chess grandmaster, and builds an illusion so convincing that it will fool every head of state in the civilized world. In 1876, Leopold hosts an elaborate international conference in Brussels. He invites geographers, explorers, and humanitarian thinkers from across Europe. The stated purpose of the conference is noble and modern-sounding. It is to explore Central Africa, to combat the Arab slave trade, and to bring civilization to its peoples. Leopold calls the organization he founds at this conference the International African Association, and frames it as a philanthropic scientific body with no territorial or commercial ambitions whatsoever. The world applauds. Newspapers call Leopold a visionary humanitarian. Queen Victoria is impressed. The United States Congress votes to recognize the organization, and Leopold, sitting at the head of this glittering table of good intentions, is already hiring Henry Morton Stanley in secret to go back into the Congo, not to explore and not to liberate anyone, but to build roads, establish military posts, and trick local African chiefs into signing treaties that they cannot read in a language they do not speak, surrendering land and sovereignty they do not understand they are giving away. In one notorious treaty, the chiefs were led to believe they were entering a trade agreement. What the document actually said, in French, was that they were surrendering all sovereign rights over their territory, their people, and all their resources, forever. Between 1879 and 1884, Stanley secured over 450 such treaties across the Congo Basin on Leopold's behalf, and then came Berlin. November 15th, 1884, the Berlin Conference, formerly called the West Africa Conference, is convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. 14 of the world's most powerful nations gather to divide the African continent among themselves in what history will later call, with cold accuracy, the Scramble for Africa. There is not a single African in the room. Leopold sends his most charming and sophisticated representatives. They carry documents, maps, and letters from American President Chester A. Arthur, who has already extended American diplomatic recognition to Leopold's International Association. They make a simple, brilliant argument. The Congo Basin should not go to Britain, France, or Germany, because that would cause a war. Instead, it should be given to a neutral, philanthropic, non-governmental organization, Leopold's Association, which has pledged to maintain free trade, suppress the slave trade, and govern the Congo for the benefit of its people. The assembled powers deliberate. They look at the maps, they look at the treaties, they look at each other. And on February 26, 1885, they hand King Leopold II personal ownership of 2.3 million square kilometers of Central Africa, an area 76 times the size of Belgium, as his private property, not as a Belgian colony, not as a protectorate, as his personal possession. A sovereign state called the Congo Free State, owned entirely by one man. Leopold reportedly celebrated by writing to a trusted aide, "I do not want to miss a good chance of getting us a slice of this magnificent African cake." The cake was now his, and the eating was about to begin. For the first few years, the Congo Free State was an embarrassment. The ivory trade, which Leopold had counted on to fund his new empire, was barely profitable. The administrative costs, the stations, the soldiers, the steamboats, the salaries, were hemorrhaging money. By 1890, Leopold's personal Congo project was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. He had mortgaged everything. He was quietly desperate. And then the bicycle was invented. It seems almost absurd, but it is true. The invention of the pneumatic rubber tire in the late 1880s followed almost immediately by the birth of the automobile. Industry created an insatiable global demand for natural rubber. Prices exploded. And the Congo Basin, it turned out, was one of the richest sources of wild rubber on Earth. Overnight, Leopold's bankrupt vanity project became one of the most profitable enterprises in the world. But wild rubber does not harvest itself. It comes from thick, sprawling vines that grow deep in the jungle, far from the rivers and the trading posts. To reach them, a man must walk for days. To harvest the sap, he must score the vine, collect the latex in a bucket, and then, in the method most commonly used in the Congo, spread it across his own body, his arms and chest and thighs, and wait for it to dry. Then he tears it off his skin. The pain is described by survivors as like being skinned alive. Under Leopold's new system, every Congolese adult male in the state was required by law to spend the majority of his waking hours harvesting rubber for the state. A quota was set, typically 3 to 4 kilograms of dried rubber per man per fortnight. If the quota was not met, there were consequences.
Leopold formalized his enforcement army in 1888. He called it the Force Publique, the public force. By the late 1890s, it had grown to nearly 20,000 soldiers, consuming more than half of the Congo Free State's entire budget. It was the most powerful military force in Central Africa. The Force Publique was built on a foundation of fear. Its soldiers were often recruited from ethnic groups that had no connection to the regions they were sent to police. Men brought from Zanzibar, Nigeria, Liberia, deliberately chosen because they had no loyalty to and no mercy for the local people they controlled. They were commanded by Belgian and European officers, many of them young men in their 20s, stationed in remote jungle outposts, unsupervised, given near total power over the lives of people they did not consider fully human. And Leopold built into this system one of the most chilling bureaucratic mechanisms in the history of human evil. Ammunition was expensive. Leopold worried that his soldiers were wasting bullets on hunting, on private quarrels, on sport. So he issued a directive: every bullet fired must be accounted for. Every shot must produce a result. And to prove that a bullet had been used to kill a person rather than waste it, a soldier was required to bring back proof. The proof was a severed human hand. One bullet, one hand. It began as an accounting measure, a bureaucratic rule, and it transformed the Congo into a landscape of systematic mutilation on a scale the world had never seen. Soldiers who needed to demonstrate productivity, whether or not they had actually engaged enemies, began cutting off the hands of the living, men, women, and children. Hands were smoked over fires to prevent decay, collected in baskets, and delivered to administrative posts to be counted like receipts. A missionary named William Shepherd, one of the first African-American missionaries in the Congo, reported in 1899 that he had found a Congolese chief who showed him 81 human right hands being smoked over a fire. The chief explained calmly that he was required to show the state how many we have killed. Missionary E.V. Schublum testified in London that soldiers told him they were rewarded according to the number of hands they brought in. Another account described a Force Publique officer who had soldiers drown 10 villagers in a weighted net, then cut off the hands of the bodies to meet his quota. In the territories controlled by private concession companies, particularly the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, known as Abir, and the Société Anversoise, the horror ran completely unchecked. These companies had purchased extraction rights from Leopold and were legally entitled, under the Congo Free State's own regulations, to use virtually any method they chose to enforce rubber quotas. Historian Jean Stengers, who spent his career studying this period, described the Abir territories as veritable hells on earth. In Abir's operating zone, a standard rubber quota required a man to spend approximately 24 days of all-day labor every single month in the jungle. The remaining days were mathematically insufficient to grow food, care for children, or maintain any normal human existence. Villages that refused to meet their quotas were burned entirely. Men who resisted were shot, their hands were cut off. Women and children were taken as hostages, held at Force Publique posts without food until the men of the village delivered their rubber. In oral histories recorded by Belgian missionaries in the 1950s, testimonies from people who had lived through the rubber terror as children, one man named Nsala described a Force Publique commander named Leon Fivet, who operated along the river approximately 500 kilometers north of Stanley Pool. All the blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. Rubber caused these torments, Nsala recalled. Nsala watched Fivet's soldiers place 10 arrested villagers into a large net, weighted with stones, and lower them into the river. He watched the soldiers wait. He watched some of his neighbors try to hold their breath, stay still, pretend to be dead. And he watched the soldiers cut the hands of the bodies, cutting the hands of men still alive, still conscious, still holding their breath in the dark water, before pulling the net back up and walking away. Several people survived by doing exactly that, by not moving even as their hands were severed, and then swimming quietly to shore after the soldiers left. These are not isolated incidents. These are not the aberrations of a few rogue commanders. These were the policy. In Brussels, at that exact moment, King Leopold II was attending diplomatic dinners. He was building monuments. He was endowing schools and parks. He was giving speeches about the importance of civilizing Africa. He was receiving delegations from the Vatican. He was corresponding with Queen Victoria. He never went to the Congo. Not once. Not for a single day in the 23 years he owned it. He never needed to. The machine ran itself. And the machine was printing money. Between 1896 and 1905, Leopold personally extracted approximately 70 million Belgian francs in profit from the Congo, equivalent to several billion dollars in modern terms. He used this money to build grand public works across Belgium, the magnificent Cinquantenaire Arch in Brussels, the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, luxury estates on the French Riviera, private chateaux in the Ardennes. The beauty of Brussels was built on a foundation of severed hands, and no one in Europe was supposed to know. His name was Edmund Dene Morel. He was 25 years old, and he worked as a clerk for a shipping company that handled Leopold's Congo trade. His job was to monitor the manifests, the lists of what ships carried in and out of port. And in 1898, he noticed something that should not have been possible. Ships arriving from the Congo were loaded with ivory and rubber, enormous quantities of both. But the ships going back to the Congo, the return voyages, carried almost no trade goods, no textiles, no tools, no foodstuffs, no medicine, nothing that would constitute payment for the goods coming out. What they carried, instead, were weapons, ammunition, and soldiers. Morel stared at those numbers and understood something that would change his life. Free trade requires exchange. You give something, you receive something. That is commerce. But if the only things going into the Congo were guns and soldiers, and the only things coming out were rubber and ivory, then there was no trade happening. There was only one word for it: slavery. Morel quit his job. He became a journalist, and he began writing furiously, relentlessly, about what he had deduced from those shipping ledgers. He founded a newspaper, the West African Mail. He wrote pamphlets, he gave lectures, he named names, cited figures, and made the argument that the Congo Free State was not a humanitarian mission, but the largest and most profitable forced labor system on earth. Leopold fought back. His agents tried to discredit Morel. They planted stories questioning his motives, his sources, his sanity. Belgian newspapers, which largely depended on royal favor, dismissed him as a troublemaker and a British imperialist acting out of jealousy. But then, something happened that even Leopold's propaganda machine could not control. Roger Casement was not a journalist. He was a diplomat, a British government official, appointed as British consul to the Congo Free State. He had first come to Africa in his youth as an idealistic young man who genuinely believed in the European civilizing mission. He had even briefly worked for Leopold's operation in its early days. By 1903, he no longer believed in anything Leopold said. The British Foreign Office, responding to increasing public pressure from Morel's writings, sent Casement on a formal investigative journey deep into the Congo interior. For 4 months in 1903, Casement traveled by river steamer and on foot into regions that no outside observer had entered in years. What he found, he recorded in meticulous, bureaucratic, devastating detail. He met a boy named Epondo. Epondo had no right hand. A Force Publique soldier had cut it off, not as punishment for Epondo did anything, but because the soldier needed to account for a cartridge he had fired. He met an entire village where virtually every adult male had been mutilated. He recorded their testimonies. He measured the rubber quotas against the available labor and demonstrated mathematically that meeting them was physically impossible, that the system was designed not to extract a reasonable tax, but to squeeze people until they broke, and then squeeze harder. He wrote it all down, every name, every date, every severed limb, every drowned child. The Casement report was submitted to British Parliament in early 1904. It was 60 pages long. It was explosive.
For the first time, the general public in Britain, in the United States, in France, in Germany, could see what was happening in the Congo, not as abstract numbers, as photographs, as names, as faces. The Congo Reform Association, co-founded by Morel and Casement, became one of the first mass membership international human rights organizations in history. It attracted some of the most prominent public figures of the age. Among its supporters were Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Mark Twain, Booker T. Washington, and Joseph Conrad, whose novel Heart of Darkness, published in 1899, had already drawn in veiled but unmistakable terms on the author's own disturbing journey through the Congo. Mark Twain wrote a blistering satirical pamphlet told from Leopold's perspective called King Leopold's Soliloquy. In it, he had Leopold mock the very photographs being used against him. The Kodak has been a sore calamity to us, the most powerful enemy we have. That photograph, Nsala's photograph, became the defining image of the Congo Reform movement. It was published in newspapers around the world. It was displayed in public meetings. People who had believed or simply never thought to question Leopold's philanthropic narrative were suddenly confronted with the unignorable reality of what his empire actually looked like. Leopold responded with the same brilliance that had served him at Berlin. He appointed his own Commission of Inquiry, the Commission of Inquiry of 1904, staffed by people of his own choosing, designed to control the narrative. He expected a whitewash. What he received was devastating. Even Leopold's hand-picked investigators could not sustain the fiction when confronted with direct testimony. The Commission's final report, released in 1905, confirmed the essential truth of everything Morel and Casement had reported. It acknowledged the systematic use of hostage-taking, the mutilation policy, the punitive raids on villages, the enforcement of impossible rubber quotas through violence. The commission carefully avoided assigning blame to Leopold personally, but the facts it confirmed made the question of personal responsibility impossible to avoid. By 1906, the international pressure had become a crisis. Belgium's parliament, which had previously refused to involve itself in what was technically a private enterprise, could no longer ignore it. The Belgian government began the process of taking the Congo away from its king. Leopold did not go quietly. Even as the walls closed in, as Parliament demanded, as international pressure mounted, as his own commission confirmed the atrocities, he deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal. He hired public relations agents. He had his sympathizers in the Belgian press write editorials questioning whether the reform movement was motivated by genuine humanitarianism or by British commercial rivalry. He argued that the critics exaggerated. He argued that abuses were isolated incidents. He argued that the Congolese were incapable of governing themselves and that any alternative to his rule would be worse. But most insidiously, he did something that would prove to be his most enduring crime against history. He ordered the destruction of the evidence. In the months before he was compelled to hand the Congo to the Belgian government, Leopold ordered his agents to burn the administrative records of the Congo Free State. Decades of ledgers, rubber quotas, death tallies, Force Publique correspondence, company records, all of it. He reportedly told his aide, "I will give them my Congo, but they have no right to know what I have done there." The fires burned for days. Historians working on this period today face a deliberately engineered absence at the heart of the archive. The systematic destruction of those records means we may never know the true scale of what happened. The death toll estimates that historians work with, ranging from 1 million to 15 million, with a growing consensus around 10 million, are reconstructed from missionary reports, colonial memoirs, census estimates, and demographic models. The actual numbers, the real accounting, was ash before the Belgian government even took custody of the territory. On November 15, 1908, exactly 24 years to the day of the opening of the Berlin Conference that had given Leopold his empire, the Belgian parliament formally annexed the Congo Free State. It became the Belgian Congo, a proper colonial territory subject to parliamentary oversight and government accountability. Leopold received 44.5 million francs in compensation for the sacrifice of surrendering his private property. He lived for one more year.
On December 17, 1909, Leopold II of Belgium died at his palace in Laeken, surrounded by his doctors and his young mistress, a 26-year-old Frenchwoman named Caroline Lacroix, whom he had taken as a lover when she was 16 years old. He was 74. His funeral was a state occasion. Dignitaries attended from across Europe. Eulogies were delivered in Parliament. Newspapers published tributes to the Builder King, the monarch who had modernized Belgium, constructed its railways and parks and public buildings, and carried the Belgian name to international prominence. There were statues. In Brussels, Antwerp, Arlon, Ostend, Ghent, all across Belgium, there were statues, monuments to the great king, plaques commemorating his generosity and vision. And the Congo remained in Belgian hands, governed now by a government rather than a king, but still colonial, still exploitative, still not free, for another 52 years, until independence in 1960. Here is the most important question this story asks. How does a man responsible for the deaths of up to 10 million people die celebrated? How does his statue stand for a century? How does his face appear on Belgian postage stamps, his name on streets, his memory honored in architecture funded by the blood money of the Congo? The answer is not complicated. It is merely uncomfortable. He controlled the story. From the moment he set foot on the world stage at the Brussels Geographic Conference of 1876, Leopold II was not merely a ruler, he was a narrative architect. He understood with extraordinary sophistication for his era that perception is power, that if you tell the story of yourself loudly enough, confidently enough, and with enough supporting detail, people will believe it. Not because they are foolish, but because the alternative, that a king decorated with medals and praised by presidents and photographed shaking hands with dignitaries is secretly engineering a continent-scale atrocity, is simply too enormous, too monstrous, too cognitively expensive to accept. He used the language of humanitarianism as a weapon. He used the word civilization as a sword. He built hospitals, real ones, funded by Congo rubber, and pointed to them as evidence of his benevolence. He endowed scientific societies. He published reports about his anti-slavery efforts. Every act of public philanthropy was a layer of paint over the wall, and the wall concealed everything. Belgium did not reckon with Leopold's legacy after his death. It buried it. The country that inherited his Congo, his Belgian Congo, continued to benefit from its resources for another 50 years. Copper, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, the same extractive logic, the same imperial infrastructure, simply managed now by a government rather than a private individual. The fundamental relationship between Belgium and the Congo did not change when the king died. The brutality was moderated, the extraction continued. And in Belgian schools, Leopold II was taught, if he was taught at all, as the Builder King, the man who gave Belgium its beautiful parks, the man who brought the Congo into the modern world. The severed hands were not in the curriculum. It was not until 1998, nearly 90 years after Leopold's death, that the story broke into mainstream Western consciousness with the publication of historian Adam Hochschild's masterwork, King Leopold's Ghost. The book synthesized decades of research from historians, missionaries, and activists, and presented the full, unvarnished story of the Congo Free State to a general audience for the first time. It was a bestseller. It won major awards, and it provoked in Belgium a crisis of identity that the country is still, in 2025, working through.
In the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and the global reckoning with the legacies of racial violence and colonialism, statues of Leopold II across Belgium were vandalized, defaced, and in several cases removed. A statue in Antwerp was doused in red paint, the color of blood and of rubber. In the city of Ghent, the municipal council voted to permanently remove its Leopold monument. King Philippe of Belgium, Leopold's descendant, wrote a letter to the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, expressing his deepest regrets for the acts of violence and cruelty of the colonial era. He did not use the word genocide. He did not use the word apology. He did not mention Leopold by name. The Democratic Republic of Congo today is one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth. Beneath its soil lie vast deposits of cobalt, the mineral that powers the batteries of every electric vehicle and smartphone on the planet. Lithium, diamonds, gold, coltan. It is also one of the poorest countries on Earth, one of the most politically unstable, one of the most conflict-ridden. The infrastructure that Leopold built was designed not to serve the Congolese people, but to extract from them. Railways that ran from the mines to the rivers, not between cities. A system architected for outward flow. That architecture did not disappear when Belgium left in 1960. Its logic persisted. Its consequences compound to this day.
Nsala, the man in that photograph, the father staring at the hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, was a real human being. His daughter's name was Boali. She was 5 years old. She was killed because her village had not delivered enough rubber. There were, by the most cautious estimates, 10 million stories like theirs. 10 million people who died or disappeared between 1885 and 1908 in a territory the size of Western Europe, owned by a single man who called himself a humanitarian. His statue stood for a century. His buildings still stand today, beautiful and well-maintained, in Brussels and Antwerp and Ostend. History, it turns out, is not a neutral record of what happened. It is a story told by those who control the telling. Leopold understood that better than almost anyone. Our job, the job of anyone who watches this, anyone who refuses to look away, is to take back the telling, to say the names, to count the hands. The Congo Free State existed from 1885 to 1908. Estimates of the death toll range from 1 million to 15 million. No individual has ever been prosecuted for these crimes. King Leopold II's statues stood in Belgium for 111 years after his death. Some still stand today.